Hello and welcome to the Life After Diets podcast. I'm Sarah Dosanjh, psychotherapist and author of the book, I Can't Stop Eating.
And I'm Stephanie Michelle, binge recovery health coach. If you feel out of control around food, we get it because we've been there.
Thank you for joining our conversations about how to make peace with food and feel more comfortable in our bodies.
Now on to this week's episode. Hello and welcome to another episode of Life After Diets. I'm Stephanie and I'm here with Sarah. And before we begin, we just want to remind everybody that we are going to be hosting a live online community event, Q&A event, Sunday, December 19th. It will be 12 p.m. Eastern time, 12 to 2. And what is it for you, Sarah?
5 p.m. UK time, 5 till 7.
To answer your questions and to get together as a community and be able to meet us and ask questions, especially around the holiday time, as things tend to ramp up both food-wise and body image-wise, and spending more time with family and giving everyone an opportunity to come in and ask questions and have a chat with us and just hang out for a couple of hours.
So if you want to join us, we'll pop a link to how you can book. It's going to be a pay what you can afford. If you want to come, we want you to come. So we look forward to connecting with some of you then. If you're listening to this in the future, I hope everything's okay there. And if you want to connect with us, hopefully we'll be doing some more lives and other events like this together going forward. So you can go to either of our websites to check that out, I'm sure. Okay.
All right. So this week, we are talking about the long range experience of having an eating disorder and or disordered eating for a long time. The listeners of this podcast in particular range from late teens to people in their 60s. I don't know if we have anyone in their 70s. Did we see that? I'm not sure.
I don't know, but if you are listening to us and you're in your 70s, let us know.
Yeah. But there's a range, and I find this, Sarah and I both find this also on Instagram and on YouTube, that these are conditions that don't discriminate by age. And so the question can come up for someone who's been dealing with this for decades, potentially, what does that mean? What is the likelihood of being able to quote unquote recover or make peace with food after many years of struggling with it? Does that change over time? And we're going to be answering that question today. And it actually comes from a listener question, which I'll throw back to Sarah to read to you. But this episode was inspired by this question that came in for us.
Thank you, Steph. We received this email. I thought it would just be a really good idea for an episode because I think it's relatable to a lot of people. No matter where you are on your journey, there's a fear that, is this something I'm going to struggle with for the rest of my life? And disordered eating has a development to it and different stages to it. I'm just going to go ahead and read what I've got here. This person writes, I developed anorexia 18-19, was hospitalized, and over the next 10 to 15 years made a slow recovery to an acceptable weight. And they've put recovery in inverted commas. So it was maybe not felt like a full recovery. However, I was left with a compulsive binge eating challenge that has mostly been managed, again in inverted commas, and I've tried not to let this behavior interfere too much with my life. I'm now 64 and still binge eat from time to time, although greatly helped by your podcast and book. I would love to hear your thoughts on the longevity of this condition and how that can impact on recovery. What always strikes me when somebody contacts me, and it happens fairly frequently, that someone in their 50s or 60s contacts me, they've been struggling with eating disorders or disordered eating for decades. And I really feel for people at that point in their journey, for many reasons, the information that just wasn't available 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Even binge eating disorder has not had its own clinical diagnosis as a standalone disorder until 2013, and it was first mentioned as a kind of other eating disorder in 1994. So if you were someone in the 80s who was struggling with binge eating, I don't know that there was anyone anywhere that you were going to find that was talking about this experience, and just how alone you might feel in that. It pains me to think about it. I feel like we live in such a great time when it comes to information sharing and being able to connect with other people and share experiences, and trying to use that sharing of experiences as a way to forge our own path to some kind of freedom. But I think a lot of people feel it's quite a depressing thought to imagine that this is something that they would be struggling with for decades. So I'm sure you've had that question thrown at you before, Steph. Is it ever possibly to fully recover? And I feel like that question is probably going to be part of today's conversation too.
Yeah. Well, there's the distinction of struggling for decades versus age. I think I personally dealt with binge eating for 25 years, which is not an insignificant amount of time. I recovered at almost 40. So while not in my 60s, and I don't know, I mean, there's times where I wonder, would it have been harder if I had another 20 years on top of my 25? And would that have changed things? But I go back to what you just said, in that there's something about the way the information is being shared now, the accessibility of more information, that there's more awareness about this. And I think there's a different approach to recovery now that just wasn't available before. And I like to think that at least in part, that has to do with the potential for recovery, because this is just something that just I don't, even if you've been through treatment, which I've met many followers, and I have clients who have been through treatment for eating disorders or binge eating many times throughout the course of their 20s and 30s and 40s, and in some cases 50s. It circles around back to the binge eating. And I've been through treatment as well, and it didn't help me either at a younger age, right? So, when I was 18, 19, no, 19, 20, I was in treatment for binge eating, and I had a lot of treatment and it didn't work. And I think it's more about seeing it differently now, as not a case of willpower or trying to get you to stop eating so much. I think the whole approach has changed in terms of how recovery, at least how I see it, has been effective. And so that promise transcends a little bit of the age factor. That said, it becomes a safety blanket after that, after so many years, and it becomes your way of life, and it becomes the way that your brain is conditioned to behave. And there's that part that is a bit different from someone who maybe has struggled for it for a year or a couple of years. And then that's another factor of breaking that habit cycle almost, and the way that the brain is wired to just continue doing what it knows best and what's familiar. But I don't believe that that's nearly as, it sounds more daunting than I think it is. And I'm only saying that because I felt so entrenched in my habits of thinking, and also in the safety that binge eating provided for me, and how I learned, like, binging for me was also a way that I protected myself, and it was my way of retreating from the world when it got too much for me. When I felt insecure or ashamed of myself, I would just binge, and then I would not go anywhere. And then I would, like, that was how I managed my emotions in so many ways. And yet, and I did that for 25 years, and from a place where my brain was just forming, and that's when it started. So, and yet I was able to recover to the degree that I'm here. And that, I don't know, I did. And so I have faith in that. And I really do think that there's something to the recovery process and the particular approach to the recovery process that can rise above, I guess, the habit loops and the even the safety. Not always, but it's possible. And I really believe that.
Mm-hmm. I think the great thing about now is that with all the resources out there, and certainly for me in my recovery, there were lots of things that I could go to that would help me reset. Whereas if you're going into a treatment center, historically, you'd have this intensive treatment, and then you'd be back out on your own, expected to implement it all now in a completely different environment. Yes, you would have talked about how to do that in treatment, but there's still the actuality of putting that into practice. And when an old environment or an old trigger or a behavior or something sets off all that thinking again, what I found had really helped me was having those resources to go back to. And they're ones that I've previously talked about on my Instagram and stuff like that, like Byron Katie's work and some of Brooke Castillo's thought work and Eckhart Tolle, letting things go and coming back to the moment. all those things were available, that when I was spiraling and catastrophizing and feeling very distressed, I could use to reset myself. And I'm thinking that even when all my eating distress and problems started, that wasn't easily available. I didn't have that. I often talk about recovery as a creative process. So rather than it being about trying to stop a behavior, trying to stop binge eating, for example, it's about what am I trying to create for myself that's incompatible with that. And whenever we're trying to learn something new, the old thinking is really compelling and it keeps trying to pull us back to the familiar. And I think communities, resources, available information can keep reminding us of what this new way of thinking and this new way of being is. So I think we live in a time where it's even more hopeful, this idea of being able to change our minds and to change very long-standing ways of feeling and believing and behavior when it comes to something like food. I also think that there's such a problematic notion out there, and I know we've touched on this before, about recovery being a place that you arrive, that you get somewhere and you're like, oh, now I never have to worry about this stuff or think about it again. No, there are things I have to do to look after myself with food. And if I'm neglectful about that, or I'm not checking in with myself, or I'm not paying attention, it can be a slippery slope back to the old. I don't think I can ever be as free and easy around food as I would have been in my younger years before any of this started. For me, it's not been possible to get back to that, because I think once you struggled with food, it does change something. That doesn't mean it's always going to be as you are now, but it may mean building something new, because that has existed in your brain. Your nervous system and your neurology, your emotions have had that experience with food now, and that can't be undone. But I think we're creators. That's what human beings are. We create these lives and we create thoughts and we create emotions, and it's breaking those automatic habitual patterns and introducing something new, which I think is really possible now. One thing I did want to say about the email that we got was that transition from very restrictive, whether it's anorexia or a very restrictive relationship with food, into a chaotic, out of control one, is a familiar story. And if you're someone, especially if you struggled with anorexia and everyone was concerned about you because of your anorexia, and then when you were weight restored, for want of a better word, everyone's like, oh, she's fine. Even if you were getting bigger than you wanted to be, and maybe bigger than they wanted you to be, they'd be like, oh, that person's fine now. And nobody sees that distress that I think is more obvious if you have anorexia and you're at a low weight, because it's absolutely possible and to have anorexia and be at a higher weight. And I think sometimes when you've had anorexia, you may be weight restored, but your brain still struggles with anorexia, but your body and your behavior seems to be telling a different story. That, I think, is a really distressing but very common narrative for a lot of people who are stuck in this position.
And it's relevant, especially when we're talking about dealing with this for a long time. Most of the clients that I have who are dealing with that are post-menopause or in menopause, because the body will change, the estrogen changes and weight, as it should, is gained, during this time. And yet the brain is still the same, and it has the same restrictive mindset. Nothing about that changed, nothing about the food intake changed, but the body changed just because the hormones changed. And I think then sometimes often I'll see that there's a tighter clinging to those restrictive behaviors, which then usually seem to intersperse with the binging. I like that'll come into the picture now, where it's like they're the alternating path of restricting in the anorexia, and then having these binges that pop in and out during menopause when the body is growing, and then it's like it doesn't feel valid. There's no one that can see it. I hear that one coming up a whole lot. And so one of the things that I think is really interesting about this moment in time, as far as recovery goes, is the somatic healing and the somatic experiencing work, because many times for clients or people who are following me and writing in that are dealing with decades of disordered eating to, into 50s and 60s, I have also a past history of trauma from childhood. And the somatic experiencing approach, it looks at a different way of healing, not through like talking therapy or, the just weight restoration, but also like releasing stored energy in the nervous system, from that emotional point of view, where emotions at one time became overwhelming for the system. Usually this is happening, as children or, in teenage years, got locked in the body, and that's when the eating disorder presented itself, and it sort of is still holding on because of this locked energy in the body. And this somatic experiencing, I will recommend it to many of my clients they're doing all of this work simultaneously, because it's not something that's ever been addressed before. So I have clients who are like, I've been doing therapy for all these years and I've gone to treatment and I've done all this stuff, but the behaviors are still here. And so we'll work on, okay, bringing in that piece into the treatment, because it's the emotional component that you can only intellectualize that so much. And so I think that that's another promising approach that exists now that didn't exist before, that is providing hope to people that I'm working with. It's really releasing a lot of stored emotions in there that's allowing for more of the intellectual processing to actually be happening. I personally think that like in 20 years time, this is going to be something that's like, oh yeah, like that's a necessary component of eating disorder recovery, because it's just like a whole half of the story that we're not necessarily hasn't been dealt with, because we don't know a lot about emotions and it hasn't been given a lot of attention beyond the intellectualization of it. So um, yeah, just as another aside and something I've been thinking a lot about, for anyone who's unfamiliar with that, there's a somatic experiencing directory out there that you can locate practitioners in your area, and this is all around the world. So as another point of hope for anyone who has not yet ventured into that form of healing.
Mhm. And if people are interested in knowing more about that, there's an excellent book called, do you know The Body Keeps the Score?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, by,
Yes,
I want to say
big one.
Bessel van der Kolk, something like that. I can't remember his name.
And yeah, I can't quite say it anyway.
No.
And also Peter Levine is a pioneer of that, Waking the Tiger.
Mhm.
We can put some links also in the show notes about that, because it's if it's not something you're familiar with or haven't learned about, it's fascinating stuff. And there's great resources to get started with on that.
We just want to grab a moment of your time to let you know that we are now on YouTube. So if you can't wait for the next episode, we are going to be uploading the podcast onto our YouTube channel a day early. So please head over there and subscribe. We are Life After Diets Podcast on YouTube and on Instagram, and you can email the show lifeafterdietspodcast@gmail.com.
And if you're interested in working with me, Stephanie, I work with clients one-to-one, and I also am enrolling for a group program to work on intuitive eating foundations with a binge and emotional eating recovery lens. You can apply at www.iamstephaniemichelle.com/application.
And if you want to connect with me, Sarah, I am the Binge Eating Therapist on Instagram and YouTube, and my website is thebingeeatingtherapist.com. Now let's get back to the episode. Yeah, and you're right. We don't really understand emotions at the physical level. We know that, yes, there are sensations that we have in the body, and they often want to be expressed in different ways. I know for me, I'm a big fan of crying. I love crying. When if I surrender into it, there is such a sense of calmness, and everything feels so much clearer and so much brighter after a good cry. And for years, I couldn't. When I was really in the binging, I remember times when I would really want to cry, and I couldn't get there. And crying was a big part of my recovery. Sometimes when I wanted to binge, I would just cry.
See, I couldn't get there. I actually still find it hard to cry. I sometimes really want to, because I know we would release something.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny, just as an aside, I was putting my daughter to bed last night. She's 7. And every night as we're laying in bed, we say, what was the best part of your day? We call it the BPD. What was your BPD? And then that was how it started. And then they picked up and they're like, and what's the worst part of your day? They always want to talk about the worst part too, but they call it a day pain. And so we were doing that. They're like, what was your BPD and what was your day pain? And my daughter said, my day pain was when I cried, because she was crying earlier about something, and she goes, and my BPD was crying. And it was so interesting because, like, independently, like, she was just like, it was the best and worst part of my day. And I totally got it, because she was just like, it felt good. She was like, it felt good to cry. She goes, but it was also sad. But that's such a child perspective of like that experience of crying being something that is both painful and releasing. And it just reminded me when you said, that you like to cry, that's
Is
that's
that a
interesting.
child perspective? Because to me that sounds incredibly mature. I wouldn't have thought that kids would label
She's
something
like
as
that.
both. Wow.
She just says things as she sees them. She's always been like this. Like she says these like very profound things, and my husband and I are always just like just stare at her. Like you're just like, you are an old soul.
We should get her on the podcast. I also think it must be very frustrating for people who have been, let's say, struggling with this for decades and maybe are in the sort of 50s and 60s to be watching younger people talking about recovery. I think the whole community aspect of this is about finding other people who you can resonate with. So I'm also wondering whether when you feel like you've been when you've been in that position where it's been 50 years for you, like 25 years, like what you said, is a massive amount of time in my mind. It's hugely significant amount of time and longer than I struggled for. But if it's 50 years, even hearing 25 years, can feel like there's that gap there. And I looked, before we started this podcast, I had a look at my Instagram analytics to look at the breakdown of my audience. And I think 1% of my followers are over 65 and 15% are over 45. And you can have a quick look at yours.
Yeah.
While I talk, I can see you getting your phone out. That presents just some challenges in and of itself, is we are looking for people who we can, I don't use aspire to, but who we could resonate and go, that could be me. So somebody who's been struggling for 20 years could see you, Steph, and go, great, like it's possible. Steph struggled for 25 years. I've thought after 20 years I'll never recover, and now I can. But somebody who's been struggling for 40 years might go, yeah, and and
yeah, I think that's a valid point, because I think that's an incredibly lonely place to be. And there's particular followers I have who talk to me all the time, and we like have gotten to know each other over the past year or two, and some of them are in their 50s and 60s, and they'll say that, they kind of say like, there's nobody who I really feel like, like I feel very alone, like I'm the only one. Sometimes I'll be asked, do you have any other followers that are as old as me? Because I think people are looking for that, just that feeling of, am I alone? And sometimes people will say like, some of the things that you've said just are things that I'm actually thinking and I've always thought. And that in and of itself feels like something to hold on to. But I think there's something more of this community. And I think maybe that's also because social media tends to be more, it's a younger generation thing. So it's not like, maybe there's just not as many people, there's certainly not as many people talking about their eating disorders in their 50s and 60s. I mean, I've tried to search for, it's very hard to find accounts that represent, people over 40 in general on social media. So it's definitely not, and that's just a product of perhaps generations, but then therefore it makes it harder to connect. How do I phrase this? Like, it's sometimes I think it's more difficult for younger, and I'm talking maybe the 18 to 22 age range of people struggling with food and body image issues. I find it much harder to make headway with those clients than I do older clients, because I have a few different theories on it, but I think there's something to be said of aging and reaching levels of saturation on this, and reaching like that level of disgust you get, and you're like, I'm done. This has taken up my whole life. And there's that motivational factor that doesn't necessarily always exist. I mean, I can speak to that too, because I remember when you're younger, you feel like you haven't had time to test out all the loopholes there might be. Like you're just kind of like, I can do this. Like I can figure out a way to like recover and lose weight. And, like there's just so many ways in which you feel like you just haven't had the experience of getting disgusted that much yet, at like to the levels that it can get to. And so there's something to be said too of like all of the years of doing that and reaching the point where you're like, you know what, I'm not going to live to be, and also not living for the appearance anymore. There's something about like just being oneself that starts to become more and more appealing as you get older. That certainly when you're younger, it matters a lot more how you look at, to a degree and culturally. I mean, there's more of an expectation for you to look a certain way. There's the whole like mating process that feels like there's this pressure. I hear that a lot from my younger clients, that they're like, just like, I can get on board with this intellectually, but I feel too much pressure as a young, person. And so it's an interesting thing to think about it that way too, because I see more people in their 50s anyway, who talk about this as, I'm ready. There's more of a readiness factor at that time. But then there's also more to be contending with in terms of brain synapses that have been long been rooted there. And again, the safety issue of, this is how I know how to be safe in my life. How do I learn something new now? How do I feel safe now? This is what's been working, and it doesn't feel good, but it feels good,
Yeah, and that mirrors my experience. So the therapy groups that I do are open to anyone aged 18 or over, but it's actually pretty rare for anybody under 30 to apply to join the group, because I think you grapple with this stuff for years first. The way I think about it, it's like it has to grind you down enough. As you say, like you've exhausted every other possible avenue of being able to do this in the way that you feel like you should do it, which is normally by just making yourself change your behavior and just finding more willpower and discipline and just being more of the kind of person you think you're supposed to be. And also it takes a long time for people to realize it's a thing anyway. So even today, with as much information as we have now, you probably get it too all the time. People are contacting me saying, just heard about binge eating, I've just found out it's a thing, and this is so me, I've been struggling with this for ages. And that's now. Imagine 30 years ago, the people who've been struggling for 40 odd years, it's been more than 30 years before they found out it's a thing. It's a longer time in shame, which I think does create a certain readiness, actually, which I think that's the most important thing. That's the thing that neither you nor I can teach anybody, is readiness.
Yeah.
Readiness to do this, readiness to let go, readiness to sort of surrender, to give up this fight for what we think we should be fighting for, and what we believe
I talked
possible.
about that yesterday in my closet coaching. I talked about readiness and how that is actually one of the more predictive factors of recovery, recovery being that thing. And I had so many people write back being like, but how can you teach me to be ready though? Like, well, that is a different episode, but that I haven't made yet, because I don't know. But I think it has to do with time and that level of like, I'm just sick of this. I'm sick of it. And that feeling of like, this could be my whole life. This really could. This is still going on at this time, this many years later. I'm done with this. That said, I don't want to minimize the level of difficulty, because I think I don't know. I feel like most of the clients I've worked with who have stopped binging, who have really had recovery to the degree that recovery exists, are people in their 30s and 40s. We have more information now, and for someone who's been living, there may be less hope and maybe less sense of that internal drive and motivation when you have been living so long with it, and probably seeking help in so many different ways, whether self-help books or therapy or things like that, and it hasn't worked thus far. So there's more of like a learned helplessness at a certain point.
I think there is something about the pressure. When you're younger, I can remember as a 20-year-old, 19-year-old, the possibility of living a really exciting life. You don't know what your life is going to be yet. So you can hold all these fantasies about what's going to happen and who you're going to meet and what you're going to do. And as the years go by and life unfolds day by day, and you don't arrive at this place where your life is suddenly exciting. There might be exciting things that happen, but I think, I don't know what I was imagining, that somehow I would reach this place in life where I ticked all the boxes and life was just fun and exciting and amazing every single day because I'd done everything that I was supposed to do. Like
Yeah.
that was the hope. I think that was the dream. It's almost like life has just knocked you about a bit as you go forward. You know, you've taken enough knocks that eventually you're just like splayed on the floor.
I'm done.
Yeah, I'm done. I need to do something different here. I can't keep standing up and getting in the same ring and having the same fight over and over again.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe it's just you recognize your pattern, like your patterns become very apparent at that time. You're just like, this is what I've been doing for a really long time. This isn't going to be different.
Once it's become a problem, and it's been a problem in your life to the point where it's pretty much seeped into every part of your life, it's likely to be an area of vulnerability for you. And I think that's how I prefer to think about it, rather than this idea, oh, it's something you have to struggle with. Because the fear is, if this is something that's around forever, the mind imagines that means you're going to be fighting with it every single day. And every single day it's going to take this enormous amount of energy.
Maybe the question is the pursuit of the readiness rather than the pursuit of recovery. That might be a different way of looking at it. Like, how will I ever find readiness? And to look at the ways that that might be getting interrupted, or what is in the way of readiness, or what feels like that could be. What are ways to even explore that idea, and seeking it that way? Because I think that readiness, like the barriers to readiness for me and for many people, I think, is like that weight loss idea, of like trying to recover and lose weight at the same time, like the wrapping your head around that. And so that would be an area to start to look at more, which maybe up until now hasn't been an area you've looked at or been willing to consider. So that might be a way of shifting.
The amount of times someone will say to me, I know I'm not supposed to diet, and I know I'm not allowed to diet. And it's really interesting because this message is being given to people that in order to recover from disordered eating, you have to stop pursuing intentional weight loss. That's what I see as being the case. It was certainly for myself, and I believe that to be true. However, I think people can hear that and go, oh yeah, that sounds true. That's what I'm supposed to be doing. But I think readiness also really comes from your own experience, learning something for yourself. So when people are saying, oh, I know I'm not allowed to diet, but I really want to do this, I really want to, lose a bit more weight, blah, blah, blah. And the question I always ask is, well, what happens when you focus on intentional weight loss? And when you talk about pursuing readiness, can it be that you go, okay, this might be a slightly risky thing to say on a podcast such as ours. Can you go, okay, I'm going to try and do this again, but I am going to watch myself the whole time, not going into it with the same thinking that I usually go into it. I'm going to go into it and I'm just going to watch what my mind does. What does my mind do when I pursue weight loss again? Because until you really see that happening in real time, and I went through that cycle several times, I knew that focusing on weight loss was making my binge eating worse, but I still had to go through that cycle a few more times to learn that, like at the cellular level, there's a difference between what you might cognitively appreciate to be true and what actually feels like your reality, because that doubt comes in and it's like, but what if this time I did it this way and I just made sure that I didn't go back to that? I just won't let myself go back to disordered eating, or I'll lose a bit of weight and then I'll quickly do an intuitive eating thing, so I won't have the rebound thing. All these things, the way we try and bargain with ourselves. Having the experience, finding out if that's true, being willing to actually experiment, and what is it you need to learn in order to move forward with this, and learning it through your experience, not just through what people say. I think listening to other people who've been there is really helpful, and I think people get a lot out of it, but none of what we say is going to transform anything for anyone until it's realized for themselves, and it's their truth as well as our truth.
So what's a takeaway for you from this conversation then, or something you want to leave listeners with?
I think it's easy for me to say this as somebody, who is in the place that I am now, but I think one of my takeaways is I want to instill a sense of hope, because I think we live in different times now where we have so much more that's available to us, so much more support that's available, free support as well. And even if this is something you've been struggling with for decades, for most people that I speak to, and the email that set this off as well, it has changed for this person over the decades. She's not in the same place as she was when she was 18, 19 years old. A lot has changed. And she's mentioning sporadic binging. It doesn't sound like it was where it was before. I think there can be a sense of, well, if I've been struggling with this for decades, it means nothing's changed. And there's that belief that if you're at 1, recovery is 100.
Mm-hmm.
And even if you get to a 50, is that not better than where you're at? That idea that you can get into a better place. It might not be this dream utopia that your brain is trying to create for you, but that doesn't mean there isn't hope for something better.
Piggybacking on that idea, I think maybe in the case of someone who has gone through some level of getting better to a degree, or having gone through treatment that has improved things to an extent, that again, that there's still so much more information coming out now and new ways of approaching healing, that perhaps it was an incomplete healing. Maybe there's more to do, and that there's hope for that as well. And that it's not necessarily that you reached your peak of healing and now that's it, and you have to just stay here with sporadic binges forever. I certainly couldn't have gotten there by myself. And I feel like I leaned on things, and still do in ways, on podcasts and social media and somatic work, there's different ways of approaching this that are just becoming available to us, so that might be it just might be an indication that there's more out there.
Yeah. So thank you, Steph, for an interesting conversation. And thank you, everybody, for listening. If you want to contact us, we are lifeafterdietspodcast@gmail.com, or you can connect with us on Instagram @lifeafterdietspodcast. See you next week.